Welcome to the Atheist Podcast. I'm Erin.
And I'm Kelley. Atheist is where we will explore American cultural trends through the lenses of a devout theist
And a devout atheist. We will discuss the messiness of being human.
the latest in social science, psychology, and American culture.
And what any of it has to do with Homo sapiens' longtime preoccupation with religion. Hey, Kelley.
Hey, Erin.
How's it going?
It's going pretty good. Here we are.
I know.
It's a beautiful day.
It is. It's a beautiful spring day here in St. Louis.
Yeah, and we realized today that though we're not at our year mark of releasing, but we have been doing these podcasts, recording them for over a year now.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Isn't that nutso?
It is. I love things that are like a marker of time.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, me too.
Feels like it has not been that long, but yet it has
Yeah.
been.
And if you've been with us listening, thanks for being here.
Totally. So today we're going to talk about David Brooks and his book, How to Know a Person. Kelley recommended it to me and a couple of our friends, and I started it right after that. And I've now recommended it to so many people. It's kind of the next 4,000 weeks for me.
Yeah, me too. I've started 2 book clubs on it now.
Yeah, same.
I have. Have you? I have a bunch of girlfriends that we're going to meet up in April and talk about it, and then also a group of people at school.
That's so
Yeah,
great.
yeah,
That's so great.
yeah.
Yeah, same here. That's cool.
Because it feels like a book that you want to talk about, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah.
It does. Well, so I guess we should just talk about, maybe let's talk a little bit about David Brooks and then talk about the book, so people kind of know what it is that we're talking about.
Yeah.
So David Brooks is a writer for the New York Times and
Pundit.
author. Yeah. Brilliant man.
Yeah.
He's written a lot about the importance of, I mean, the book is really more about interpersonal interaction, but a lot of where I knew David Brooks was more about that we have had historically a rich culture around religion, and that religions were really used to bring people together and to pass on wisdom, and
to do good in the world.
Yeah.
Right. What does he call them? Weavers.
Oh, yeah.
In his previous book, he's been doing work around finding people who just do good and weave community in the spaces that they live in.
Yeah, he kind of has. He has a couple examples in this book of that. That term didn't ding right away, but So the where I was going before was the kind of the passing on of wisdom traditions, but so when you don't have some sort of institution that kind of just makes it almost like a default for people, hey, I'm just sort of brought up in this environment that there is an organization around passing on these sorts of values and wisdom and tradition, and there's community and camaraderie around that it's really difficult for people to navigate the world. And that, what he's written about in that is also really underpinned by Jonathan Haidt's previous work. Jonathan Haidt from NYU, who's studies moral psychology. His work has really focused on the Righteous Mind was one of the books that he wrote that really focused on that tradition, and he was drawing from a different scholar named Emil Durkheim, who had done research around I think it's fundamentalist communities that form around religious groups, and how in those communities the rates of depression and anxiety were super low. And how it was in more secular communities where you saw a lot of more that mental health or disconnection rise. And so both of them, I mean, Jonathan Haidt and I think David Brooks are sort of well, what's going to serve in that place?
Yeah.
And Jonathan Haidt's latest book, he just released a book this week that's called The Anxious Generation. I think maybe we're going to talk about in a future episode. But his whole thing is like you take the subtitles, The Great Rewiring of Childhood.
Yeah.
And he double meaning here, right? And he's like, so that from the ages of 9 to 16, when you're going through puberty, you're like the most susceptible to like social learning. And he's like, instead of having any sort of like, he's like, in most cultures throughout the world, when you kind of reach that age, like, hey, we're going to teach you how to be an adult, there's like tradition about passing on wisdom. And instead, what people are getting is like 30-second videos from other teenagers.
Right.
And that's the wisdom.
Right.
That's being like transmitted. And he's like, it's not good.
It's not good. That's his thesis.
Yeah. I mean, for so many reasons, but that's one of them.
You know what would be like just like a home run podcast if we could score it, which, we could shoot for it, but I don't know if we'll get it. But to get like Jonathan Haidt on to talk about that book, but then at the same time get Dr. Lisa Miller, who is a professor of education. I want to say maybe she's an education and psychology at NYU at Teachers College.
Oh,
and her whole thing is like what you said, Durkheim. Is it Durkheim?
Emil Durkheim, yeah.
She did all this research and she found that, children who have a spiritual foundation, and she kind of uses like spiritual in a pretty broad sense. Their mental health issues go way, way down.
Yeah.
And so she has a whole thing on like the spiritual child and the awakened mind.
Yeah.
And it's like,
So
when you replace some kind of spiritual foundation with a phone, what happens?
That's been like optimized for virality and like just the most ridiculous content. The other that just made me think about different Brooks, Arthur C. Brooks, who's
at the Atlantic.
He writes a lot of things at the Atlantic. He's also a professor. I think he's at Harvard.
Yeah.
But
is he the happiness guy?
Yeah. His thing is like, I think it's like there's like 5 things that you need to like find like fulfillment and happiness, and his first one is this like spirituality, and he's like, it could be a religious tradition. He is religious, or at least he does believe in God. But he does a lot of interviews with scholars that don't. And often he's like, it could be any sort of wisdom tradition that is like passing on. And so that gives someone like, hey, I'm going through a difficult period in my life and I need something to
outside
anchor
of
me
myself
to like get through this, and if you don't have it, and this kind of like, but it's hard for people, kind of going back to like, why is a religious institution helpful? Because I think for a lot of people, it's really freaking hard to say, I'm going to develop my own meaningful philosophy of life.
Yeah.
And like, it takes a lot of work. And so if you just like have a default, then it's like, okay, I have this kind of safety net where I don't have to construct it for myself.
Yeah. And it doesn't mean that that's where you have to stay, right?
Yeah.
But there's this, and we're just dropping all the names here at the beginning. But like one of the things Rohr will say is order, disorder, reorder.
Yeah.
Right. So order, like we start with order. We start with something. Like we got to get something. We got to get some kind of foundational thing there, and then we can play with it. We can deconstruct it. We can parse it apart, and then we can kind of recreate something that seems to work in the world that we live in, for ourselves, for a growing and changing culture. But to do that out of ex nihilo is a little difficult.
Yes, totally.
The other thing about Lisa Miller, one of the ways that she kind of defines spirituality is not just kind of like you said, that there's something bigger than us. Whether that's love, whether that's some kind of being, prime mover, right? But the other thing is that we see connections and synchronicities, and that is a kind of a tell for living kind of an awakened life, that we see that there's connections between things, and that there's somehow some intelligence around how the world works.
Yeah. So, oh man, I mean, that gets me on my other latest thing that I've been thinking about, which is complexity theory, and also a professor from NYU. NYU's
rocking it.
And he's this guy, Neil Theist. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, but he's a professor of pathology, actually. And he's also like a student of like transcendentalist meditation and like all the Zen Buddhism and all those things. And so
I have a TM story for you.
Okay, we'll go. So
we can do that later.
Yeah.
But keep going.
So
complexity.
He what he realized when he was like looking at slides in the lab, right, is like at different levels the patterns are the same. Like if you look at a tree and then it's a branch, which is another tree, and then another branch is another tree, and the same is true of just like the way that your cells look and all. Anyway, so
vein systems.
Yes. So he wrote this book on complexity theory, and so the main idea is that like ultimately it's that everything is connected. Like you are connected to everything, to the like origin of the species, right? And so like if you trace like through your mother's genetic line, like it's going to keep going and going and going. And it's just a really cool book. And it helps you think about the way that we are actually all connected. And connected to everything in a way that is like, it's some next level stuff.
It's some next level stuff. And, which leads us perfectly into the book that we're talking about today, How to Know a Person. And the subtitle is How to See Others Deeply and Be, or How to
see others deeply and be deeply seen.
Yeah. And, it makes sense, like the longitudinal Harvard study, right? About
the
long life
Grant study.
Yeah. That the number one indicator of a long, healthy life is relationships, right?
Yep.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
I was talking to my students the other day, and I forget how this came up, but just the studies of like children who are not touched.
Oh yeah, and
or talked to.
That's like the irreparable stuff. So Lauren and I we were talking about the anxious generation and Haidt's new book, and because he's really talking about like this period of 9 to 16 or so, and as like a really formative part where your brain is in the mode of rewiring and is really, really flexible. But then we were talking about, she was like, I wonder how that compares to like 0 to 3. She's like, because those kids in, the Russian orphanages who like are never held, like you can't undo that. Like, how do you,
and in that space too, like if us adults, I have a lot
mammals.
We're mammals. But if like we adults are looking at our phones while we have a 1-year-old, and so we're not, how much is our attention, it's that attention economy, right?
Yeah.
And our children are suffering because of our own distraction and because of theirs. But I think that what Brooks offers in this book is
it's solutions.
It's really practical, and it's just really beautiful. And I, as a spiritual director, I read this and I was like, oh, well, this is a book that every spiritual director needs to read. This is about spiritual direction.
Yeah.
But then I was like, I'll bet my local butcher, if I handed it to him, he'd be like, oh, well, how did he write a book about being a butcher? This is a book about being a butcher, or this is a book about, being a teacher, being, anything. And because it's just about being a good human. Like, how do we know each other?
Yeah. So that's what when I read it, I was like, these are our answers, right? These are answers for the culture that we're in. And so one of the things that he talks about, so thinking about like having your phone while you're with your 1-year-old, right?
Yeah.
Or so he gives you like practical steps, like this is how relationships unfold.
Yeah.
And so one of the first ones is that this idea of accompaniment.
Yes.
So that you're like in a space. So for me, I'm picking up my kids from school and there are other parents around. And it's like, am I just looking at my phone? Or am I like, hey, how are you? What's new? How was your weekend? Right. And it's like those moments. And it's like, so the way he describes accompaniment, like you're all kind of, maybe you're side by side observing something else. You're at a soccer game or whatever, and you're just trying to get a feel for each other. Yeah. It's your brain and your body literally sort of saying like, do I feel comfortable with this person, right? Do I like their energy? Do I like their vibe? How do they carry themselves? And you start you have enough of these like small interactions that kind of add up. And then you go, okay, yeah, I do. Yeah. And then you want to take that next step, right? Like, okay, we should do something sometime, but yeah, it's those, but if you miss them, you miss those opportunities if you're in distraction, or it's like, easier to just be like, well, I could talk to the person in the waiting room, or I could talk to the person at the store, or I could just look at my phone.
Yeah. And also I think the term accompaniment is just like the best word ever, because it's also so generous, right? It's not looking at other people and being like, what can they do for me? It's the word implies, what can I do in this moment to learn something about this other person and offer them in terms of an opportunity to share who they are. Yeah. And then I get to like glean that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that is kind of the next thing, right? Yeah. Is that he's talking about. It's like, okay, be in space, and
be
like
in space
and have that proximity. But then lean into asking people about themselves and try to avoid kind of the more evaluative questions, and ones that are like the one that I found that's really been useful is just asking people like how they grew up, or where they grew up, because then they start talking about a lot of their history, a lot of their life history, and you don't know where the conversation will go, but you usually learn a lot about somebody.
It's funny because I don't know if you thought about this when he was talking about this, but if you're not from St. Louis, in St. Louis, the ultimate question is, where did you go to high school? Because St. Louis is a city that it was really interesting to me when I moved here. There are more high schools per capita, I think, in St. Louis than any other city.
Oh, wow.
I don't know if that's actually true, but I think I read that. I'm going to say it. I'm going to stand by it, because there's a ton of Catholic schools. There's a huge Catholic population here. And then there's also a ton of private schools. Yeah. And that was not how, where I grew up, it was like some people went to private school, but mostly you went to your public school. But here, it's not a question that whose intention is to dive deeper and really get to know a person. Right. It's an evaluative question of like, okay, you're going to tell me where you went to school, and now I'm going to make all kinds of assumptions about who you are, what your status is, what kind of, where your what your family, all kinds of things. And you do learn things because, right? But it's not the intention when we ask that question. Right. So I like that, where did you grow up, and what is what, and he, what was that like for you? And then like it's those follow-up questions too.
Totally. It's always the follow-up questions. And it's because it's about listening, right? Like it's like in order to actually ask good follow-up questions, you have to actually listen.
And that's a big part of this book too.
Yeah.
I want to mention too that I think it's really, I don't know, did you listen to the book or read the book the first time?
I listened to it the first time. Yeah. And then I read it the second time.
So I listened to it also the first time. And so he reads it.
Yeah, he does. Yeah.
And it's I would encourage people to listen at least to parts of it, because I do think he 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 is a self-proclaimed kind of in, introvert, kind of stoic, kind of not in a very expressive person. Right. He expresses himself through writing and not really through speaking and interactions and stuff.
Yeah.
And I think he has, and he'll say he's gone through a real transformation himself in the last 10 years or so. That I think a lot of these books have come out of this transformation. And it's interesting to see somebody like a public figure kind of change and grow and do things like that. But he's very self-deprecating and kind of like, I'm not an expert in this, but I know that this is a lack in me. And so I am going to, like most smart people do, and researchers, he's a researcher as a journalist. I'm going to research how to do this thing that I am not good at.
Yes.
And so he comes at it from that like beginner's mindset.
Yep.
And I think that's really inviting.
It is.
To listen
it
to.
is. I think a lot of writers and researchers and scholars, like they're a lot of times they are writing about the question or studying the question that they want an answer to.
Yeah.
Because it's personal to them.
Yeah.
For it's like, man, I haven't figured this out, and I'm writing the thing I need to hear.
Yeah. I'm writing the thing I need to hear.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I love that. And as I was listening to the book, he really uses himself as a lot. It's really a big,
his relationships.
Yeah. It's for as practical as this book is, there's, it's very much a personal essay.
Yeah.
And so he uses a lot of, his own examples, and you can, I don't know if you could tell, I could definitely tell he gets choked up as he's reading it.
Yeah.
In places.
For certain parts. Well, the other thing that he uses his own personal anecdotes, but also, and I thought this was really effective, was memoir. Other people's. Sections of other people's memoirs to like kind of illustrate the different dynamics of relationships, or how knowing someone like shifted a person's life, or like, just the way that they were moving through the world, all of a sudden it was transformed or different. That there's a passage where he's recounting this group of people and this man's memoir after they had been through a tsunami. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Oh
I was
yeah.
just
Oh
sobbing.
my gosh. Oh my gosh. Yes.
But it's like really powerful. Really powerful.
Powerful. Yeah. Yeah. We won't tell you what the story was, but he uses really, really powerful stories. And, I've read some criticisms of the book that, Brooks is still kind of talking from this kind of elitist standpoint of like dinner parties. And I'm like, just because the guy goes to dinner parties doesn't mean he's elitist. But I he definitely comes from a certain, he grew up in Manhattan.
Yeah.
He works in New York. He went to, did he go to Harvard, or he went to
University of Chicago.
Oh, that's right. University of Chicago. And, so he definitely he has a perspective.
Yeah.
But I think that he's immersed himself in enough different kinds of stories that I think it'll speak to a lot of different people.
Yeah.
And the other part of the accompaniment part too is like, how do we accompany people in their suffering?
He does. That's a big part of, that's what that was really touching, I thought too. And it kind of he's talking about how important it is to show up for people when they are suffering.
Yep.
And that it's just about being there, and like, hey, oh man, that part really got me.
Yeah. And he also starts with a chapter on challenging conversations, which I think is really helpful because in our culture right now, with the divide that there is, making connections are not necessarily just going to be easy, and they're going to require some challenging conversations. And how do we have those kinds of conversations? Yeah.
And I think to his point too, right? Like it's that if you those kinds of conversations, knowing someone, it happens over time.
Mm-hmm.
It's obviously needs to happen in person.
Yep.
And like if you're going to have a rich dialogue with somebody, versus like, hey,
Yeah.
like if you have a relationship with somebody, you can talk about and have different perspectives
Mm-hmm.
and be able to kind of be open to the possibility of being persuaded. Or your mind opened.
Yep.
But if you're like, hey, I'm just on the internet and I'm writing at you and you're writing at me, and it's just like we're just yelling back and forth and it's not no one's growing from that.
No.
So, and he writes at the in the introduction, I think he talks about like that kind of in the age of technology and artificial intelligence, that people who have this skill, this is going to be the most important skill that's left, right?
Yeah.
And it made me think of Esther Perel talks about like the other AI is the phrase she used, which is artificial intimacy.
Oh,
and which I think is really smart.
I've
right?
never heard that.
Yeah, and she says it's the appearance of connection, but actually causes the things that cause disconnection.
Yeah.
And that's what social media and technology driven interaction does, is it gives you the appearance of connection without actually having real intimacy with anybody.
Yeah. He says probably, I don't know, 30 times in the book. And this is something we don't need, we don't teach in schools, and we need to.
Yes.
And I think that's why I wanted I invited everybody at my school to like, who wants the book? Because I'm going to buy you the book. I'm using like.
Did you really?
Yeah, because I was like, I have some professional development money left. I think this is what I want to leave to everybody.
That's awesome. How many people took you up on it?
I think I have like 25.
That's awesome.
Yeah, 25 people.
That's really good.
Yeah, so I'm really excited, and but I think that it's like these are skills.
Yeah.
That
you teach that couldn't be taught, because they are they're skills, they're habits, they're things that you have to do with intention. You have to think about like it is a training of a kind, right? Like you're thinking about, okay, I'm going to be in this situation, how am I entering into this space? And if you do that, you'll find that it's very rich, and it's something I've observed and I've talked a lot about, especially with my oldest child, who is he's probably the most introverted of the bunch, and he's just struggles with like putting himself out there, and I know it comes from a place of like, when you struggle with that, it's because you're like, I don't want to be rejected, right?
Sure,
like
of course.
that's what it comes down to. But then it's like the pain of being rejected, which is real and painful, but is also like, if you never do it, you never get the other side, which is when you do find someone where you are fully like, they've fully embraced me, right? Like they fully love me, and you have to take those risks. Of the pain to be able to like be in the, it just like, that's the only way that it works.
It's what do you call it? What's that kind of therapy where you just have to do it?
Cognitive behavioral therapy?
No, like for OCD, when they're just like, I'm afraid of worms, so they make you hold a worm.
Yeah. Oh,
exposure therapy. Yeah.
Okay.
Because it's funny because there's there's addictions of addition and addictions of subtraction. And so addictions of subtraction are fear-based, of like, I'm going to avoid these things.
Yeah.
Because, right. And so those kinds of, sometimes some of those anxieties, like social anxieties. It's like you have this like anxious feeling leading up to the thing, but then you do it and it kind of
it dissipates, right? Well, there's like the eustress, right? Like there's the stress that's like the good stress that's you're like, before I have to give a talk or before I have to like present something to a client, like I get a little nervous, you know, and then but you're because then you're like a little bit more focused, you're more aware, you just like can dial in a little bit more, and then it's over and you can kind of that feeling can dissipate.
And then you can look back at that experience and go, oh, well, I didn't die that time.
Yep.
So now it's going to be a little easier this time.
Every time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is like when you're like jonesing for that cigarette and there's that anxiety, like, oh, I want it. And if you don't do it, it's like what? I think there's like 3 minutes or 6 minutes that they say.
Yeah.
And then it
subsides.
It subsides.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
It's the same kind of anxiety, but just in a kind of positive and negative way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That makes me think of the Jonathan Haidt's other book, the Coddling of the American Mind, where he's kind of opens with the nut allergy thing, right? Like that everyone was like, oh, we like can't have any exposure to nuts, and then the rates of people being allergic to nuts just like skyrocket. And you're like, oh, actually, you need to have exposure to something that's going to challenge your immune system if you don't want to have like an over response. And it actually, like, what that makes me think of too, this is a complexity theory thing, but they talk about, he writes in the book, it's like that sustainable complexity or sustainable systems thrive on negative feedback loops, not positive feedback loops. So the easiest thing to think about is like an air conditioning unit. So it's like, oh, this room is getting a little warm. So the air conditioning unit is constantly testing the temperature in the room. Oh, it's getting warm, kicks on, right? It brings the temperature back down, brings back it to homeostasis. So everything in nature and in your body is trying to be at homeostasis. Yeah. So for every reaction, there's an equal and opposite reaction, essentially. And but a positive feedback loop would say, oh, this room is getting a little warm. I'm going to make it warmer, right? And so the positive feedback loops ultimately become in the body and in economic systems, like they become, well, in everything really, the force of destruction. So positive feedback loop is cancer. All of a sudden I have the cells replicating that should be inhibited but are not. In an economic system, it's like a bubble that's like, all of this like money that's pouring into whatever, and then it eventually explodes. So this idea of homeostasis is something that he's talking about, and negative, but I've been thinking about that from like a cultural standpoint. Like, when do we get into situations from a cultural standpoint that we get into like a positive feedback loop, right? Which means I think, right, like we think we're in this. Yeah. And
I mean, this is like the echo chamber, right?
Yeah. Like it's just going to reinforce, and then nobody ever is going to be like, hey,
until the culture just explodes.
Bingo.
Yup. Because there's no rich dialogue that's actually,
bringing things back towards a balanced level. Yeah.
And, okay. So we are just on fire with dropping names today. Okay. So David French had an article this weekend.
Also David.
All the Davids. And
I read this, I think.
Did you about Christian nationalism?
Oh, no, no, it was a different one.
So he looked at this data on people who think that white Christian nationalism is a problem, or who are even aware of like the presence of white Christian nationalism. Yeah. And the statistics have not changed in like, I forget, I don't know if it's like 3 years but like it has been talked about so much. I mean, there are like, I listened to this lecture where this guy was saying basically publishers now on both sides of the aisle like are using that term to sell their books, whether they're selling it to the left or they're selling it to the right. Like it is a term that is right. People are
paying attention
to. And there's this, really like hot debate about what is it and is it, and so David French was like, why have these statistics not changed? And then, so as he kind of parses it out, what he comes to is this is a hotly debated topic that's really just hotly debated online. And the people that are hotly debating it online are the the 10% like way on the left and the 10% way on the right. And so the people that are in this space of homeostasis who could kind of bring some, balance to the I don't know, from my perspective, I don't know if there's much balance in that conversation, but they're not engaged in the conversation. But because we're in it, in this echo chamber, it's really not moving the needle.
Yeah. That's interesting.
Yeah. So that's the other part of this. Yeah. So the echo, the reality is that probably 80%, I don't know. I would like to think that 80% of this country is sane and in a, maybe not.
I don't think it's that high.
You don't think it's that high? I think, let's just say the majority. Let's say maybe a 55%.
I'm going to send you to the emergency room with Lauren, and then you come back and you tell me that percentage.
Yeah.
What you think that percentage is.
Okay.
You asked her, she would be like 20% of people actually have their shit together, and everybody else is crazy.
Crazy. I'm talking like centrists, like people who are kind of more centrist in terms of their ideology.
And actually, the first thing when you said, "Where did David Brooks go to college?" That I thought I was like, he went to University of Chicago because, and I'm sure this isn't universal, but I have found of scholars in particular that are from the University of Chicago, they are more moderate. They're more moderated in their, and it's because they're, I think it's like the classical, like liberal education, which is like, hey, you have to be sort of rigorous and like scientific in your thinking, and don't jump to conclusions. There's lots of spurious correlations, they just kind of beat that into you in a way that's good. It's good thinking.
Yeah. What doesn't he make some kind of joke about University of Chicago in like the first chapter?
It's known for being very intense. I don't know if it's still like has that brand, but they actually, so like in this polarization topic, when lots of campuses that were doing the more like left-leaning stuff, were creating speech codes where you couldn't call someone like a freshman because that was offensive, things like that. The University of Chicago was like, so here, negative feedback loop, right? University of Chicago is like the only school in the country that says no, like that kind of stuff is not going to happen here. Like, we are committed to freedom of speech and expression, and we're not going to go around censoring everything, because if we do, we're going to create a positive feedback loop, which is that you're going to get more
language that is
now offensive and not allowed to use. So they were like the first school in the country to sort of really see on the landscape, like what was going on, and saying like, we are going to use our power to like say, we're not going to engage in this, something that is going to that we can tell is going to turn into a positive feedback loop.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Well, let me ask you this, Erin.
Yeah.
In terms of knowing people well, this is something I've always, I'm going to make a comment and then I'm going to ask you a question.
Yeah.
This is something I've always really loved about you, is that I feel like you are somebody who intentionally reaches out to people to make connections and to get to know people. Like, you have always been such a welcoming person, and you've intentionally put yourself out there, which is not always a comfortable thing.
Yeah.
And I think because of that, you create really rich relationships around you.
Yeah.
And you make people feel at ease and welcome. Can you kind of tell us a story? And this is something else Brooks talks about, is like engaging the narrative,
storytelling,
right? Can you tell us a story about a time when you've put yourself out there to create a friendship, and it was really like, and you made a good friend?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I thought you were going to ask the opposite, which is like where it blew up.
No.
Oh my gosh.
That would be it. Well, I want to go to the positive.
Yeah, no, I like that. I like that. Well, yeah, I mean, I mean, actually, here going back to like my conversation with my son,
Yeah.
I was kind of walking him through like David Brooks. I actually made him read this book also.
Aww.
And
he's in what?
Season 6th grade.
6th grade.
Yeah. And so I'm like, hey, you want to understand how this works? Like, this is how it works, right? And so a friend of one of his classmates, his that he likes, his mother, I also have met through like different social situations, right? So we were kind of in a phase of, I would say over the last couple of years, accompaniment, right? We were not like friends. I mean, we liked each other.
Yeah.
We were acquaintances, I would say. And but we'd be at different events or parties or whatever. And I always kind of just observed her, and I was like, she seems cool, right?
Yeah.
Like someone I'd like to get to know. Like the more times I spent around her, the more I kind of felt that way. And then we went to this charity event for the Children's Hospital, and it was like it was a 90s themed, like decades theme, right? You have to dress up. And she and her husband come in these like Run DMC.
So had you like invited them to come with you?
No, I didn't even know they would be there.
Oh,
so
okay.
our mutual friend, which is how we kind of knew each other, was on the board.
Okay.
So she invited all these people. So we like whoever came. So I didn't know they were going until I guess I did know maybe like the day before or something. But like we weren't necessarily going together.
Right.
So they show up and she's in this like Run DMC outfit, right? And it is just like the sweats and the gold chain and the bucket hat. And I'm just like, man. And then we hit the dance floor and she's out there dancing. I'm just like, this person is so cool, right?
Yeah.
And so then I was just like, and it was kind of in the same time frame where I was like reading this book, and we were going to be at a dinner party, and I knew that she was going to be there, and I was like, this is somebody that I like want to try to become friends with. And so I was like really intentional. Like when we got into conversation, I was asking like, so wait, like, how did you grow up? She was talking about one of her parents. And so that was like, okay, this is a perfect time to kind of like try to get deeper into this conversation. And at the end of it, she was like, oh, that was like a really deep conversation,
Yeah.
And
you were like, you were just Brooks.
Yeah, exactly. And so anyway, since then we've like hung out, and it's been like a really rich. It's like a new friendship, but it's been really good. But I will say, like the other part of that too, like I've had a lot of friendships that like have kind of evolved in that way and have been really rich, and I just feel really blessed. I mean, and also like this other core group of friends that I have who just like when his whole thing about like showing up for like people when they're suffering, man, I have been really like blessed in that regard. And I feel like I also try to give that back, or would give that back to any of those people and anyone that I am friends with or care about. When someone is going through a hard time, that you show up for them. But the power of that is just, it's so deep. And it's like, I've got your back, right? You know, and
there's like nothing better.
There's just nothing better than that. And that's why, when we go back to like, why is it that people who live a long life, that have rich relationships, it's that. Yeah. It's like,
because we can't do it alone.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah. And I feel like like that's a great example of like, and especially, as adults making new friendships.
Yeah.
That can be really challenging.
Yeah.
And so I do think that this is a way to kind of, reach out
absolutely
and create relationships. And it's like a way to also a guide to kind of, relationships take work.
Yes.
And so there is, I actually gave this book to my daughter too,
Yeah.
and she and her boyfriend are reading it
Oh,
together.
that's so sweet.
Because
Yeah.
it's a skill
Yeah.
to cultivate and grow a relationship
Yep.
also.
Yep.
A relationship that's really been important in my life is my mentor Nick, who you know.
Yeah.
He was an English teacher, and I kind of glommed on to him pretty early when I
Yeah.
started teaching, and I was like, this guy is really cool. He's really smart.
Yeah.
And I reached out. We started to spend some time together. Like we went to a couple movies together.
Yep,
We would go
yep,
out and have a
yep.
drink or whatever. And also I love that too, because like,
Yeah.
a male female
Yes,
relationship,
those are the best. Yeah.
and people who say that you can't be friends with, the opposite
Well,
sex. It's
I
kinda
can do
crazy.
it.
Yeah, you can do it. You can do it.
I'm like in a special category. I have a lot of male friends, and
Yeah.
I think that, but I think it's because I'm gay. Like
Yeah.
that, their wives are like whatever,
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I do too, though. Like, that's never
been a
been
thing.
something for me.
Yeah,
I don't
yeah.
know.
Yeah.
Anyway. But Nick and I, and then he did an amazing thing. So then he was kind of my mentor, and I really reached out to him and asked him to kind of mentor me in some really specific ways
Yeah.
around like writing and conferencing with kids and doing things. And then when he retired, he did this beautiful thing, and he asked me if like I would mentor him, if he could be my assistant. And I was like, what? That was also really something, because he's around the same age as my dad. I think actually he and my dad are like the same age.
Yeah.
And so here for this kind of like man, that I looked up to, kind of, to kind of look to me
Yeah.
as an expert was just really, really beautiful. And then there was a year, I don't know what it was. I think it was like a year I had to drop off Hannah like every morning, like really early, because she was singing really early at school or something. So I had time before my classes started.
Mm-hmm.
So Nick and I literally walked like 5 miles in the park every day for a year.
That's awesome.
And Nick is a talker.
Yeah.
And so we would walk hell or high water.
Yeah.
And most of the time, I mean, we talked back and forth. I'm not saying like Nick was like lecturing me.
Yeah.
But I learned so many stories like about his life.
Of course.
And so it was really funny. So, and I loved them. Nick is like this wise person. He's funny. He's creative. He's a great teacher. And he was also a really generous listener. So, sometimes like I would bring like things that I was working on in the classroom, and I'd be like, what do you think about this? And he would let me kind of talk them out. Yeah. And he was just a great sounding board. And we were walking too, which is also, it takes some of that social anxiety out of it.
I love it.
Yeah. So, but I was getting so many great stories, and I was like, man, I need to remember these stories. Yeah. And I also, I don't know, I wanted to like commemorate it in some way. So I started to, I had my phone with me, and so I would surreptitiously push record on my phone, and we would walk, and I would record it, and then I would go to school, and like before class or between classes or something, I would transcribe the story, and I made a blog of like all like Nick stories.
That's so.
And then I gave it to him for Christmas.
Oh my gosh!
I know,
that's so cute.
It was really cute. But I got to say, like, that was one kind of, that year was a really, I think, formative time for us to kind of, share those narratives. And then there was other things, that we did projects and different things together. But to have a relationship with somebody who's, another generation.
Yeah, I love those.
And
those
also, like, a man.
You need more. It's like, I mean, that's part
diversity.
Yeah, it gives you more windows into the world, right?
Yeah.
Like more pieces of the puzzle with different perspectives. It's so important. It's so valuable.
Rich.
It makes, yes, it does. It makes your life richer.
Yeah, and and then I think, I don't know if Brooks ever uses this term. I don't think that he does, but a term I use a lot is you have your chosen family.
Yeah.
You have your family.
Yeah.
But then you get to choose people who are who are your family too.
Yeah.
And if you're lucky enough to have these deep relationships where you feel this person and they know you.
Yeah.
Then we have this beautiful extended family.
Yeah. Yep.
And when they do those kinds of studies and they look at different neighborhoods that are filled with like Italian families, that all like live together and are all related, and, and they never die.
Yeah.
And it's not just because they're eating olive oil all the time.
Right.
It's also because they have these, rich extensions. So, yeah.
So what would be what's your like biggest takeaway from the book that you would share, carry with you, advice you would give to somebody based on it?
I think, that there's a level of intentionality in every relationship, whether it's just like he tells a great story about sitting on a plane and like actually engaging the person next to him in conversation, and the generosity of really wanting to learn somebody's stories. I mean, he's freaking David Brooks, right? And he's wanting to know about this person who's sitting next to him in the middle seat. I'm sure he's and so I think the intentionality around using every interaction with every human being as an opportunity and a gift to kind of learn more.
Yeah.
And make that connection and lean in, which is also a Brene thing too, right?
Yeah.
Leaning in. What about you?
So a similar take, but maybe just a slight variation of that, which is that small things often, the kind of one of the life philosophies, that I have and it's that, right? It's like, it's small moments that build up over time. And then when you have those small moments that you are intentional, you do lean in, you do say, hey, like we should go for a walk, or I'm checking in on you, haven't talked in a while, like calling someone on the phone to talk. I mean, I do that a lot. I'm like the last person. I feel like that still like calls people all the time.
Yeah.
But
my friend Bess, like she calls.
Yeah.
She's a caller.
Yeah.
She prefers that.
I like it.
Yeah.
It's just nice. It's like, but it's these small interactions that eventually lead up to bigger moments that give you the opportunity to be like, to show up for somebody, right? And or that they would show up for you, or whatever. Or just so I think it's that. And so it's like saying yes to things, But that intentionality married with like, it's not, relationships aren't built from like grand gestures, right? They're built from, which are nice. Yeah. Grand gestures are nice, but it's more that it's this like these small interactions over time. And that's one of the things I that I worry about, like
with our kids.
Yeah. That they're missing a lot of that. Because it is those like, those interactions that are in person, not mediated by technology, that are the ones that lead us down the path of having rich, meaningful relationships and then lives. Yeah.
Yeah. And, I would add to that too, that this idea, it doesn't have to be two people meeting equally at the same place too.
Yeah, no.
That these small gestures,
most of the time it's never going to be equal.
No, it's never. So when you sit next to somebody at a party, at a baseball game, on a plane, and you make the decision, this is the most important person. This is the most important thing right now in the room. My attention is on this person.
Yeah.
And not that I'm like a freak and gonna freak this person out.
Yeah.
But like I'm gonna offer my attention to this person.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna let this person know that I'm interested in who they are.
Yeah.
And that small gesture might be enough that it awakens something in them.
Yeah.
That then they, pass that on, whether they're, cognizant of it or not, and that's the whole thing with mindfulness, with with when we work on ourselves, or when we ground ourselves, when we find awe in the world, when we're doing things that are generative for us and for the people around us, it has a ripple effect.
It does.
And so even just the building,
and we can't predict
where it's going to go.
Yeah.
And that's how we make the world a better place.
Well said.
Well, thanks.
I think that's a good note to end on. And we're gonna kind of continue a variation of this conversation for our next episode.
We're gonna practice it.
Yeah, we're gonna play a game. So definitely come back.
Yeah.
And check out the second part of this How to Know a Person series.
Great. As always, thank you to our audience for investing your time and listening to us. Please subscribe, leave some feedback, and rate our podcast. Most importantly, share it with a friend. Our show will only grow because of you.
Atheist is produced by Justin Seiwell and Trend Media STL. You can follow us and other great podcasts on Instagram at STL Podcasts. Also, check out the show notes for links to our Substacks. Thank you for listening, and keep looking for connection.